Okay, so I put together a PowerPoint, so I'll just share screen and pull that up. If you have any questions as we go, just sort of raise your hand and ask them or put them in the chat, and we can address them as they come. Okay, so share screen. Oh, wait, the chat has now disappeared. Why did it do that?
I can see your slides, Dave.
Yeah. I thought I might be able to have the chat up on the side of my screen, but
Okay.
it isn't there. Oh, let me just see what happens if I press chat. Oh, there it is. I can do it. Oh, there's a note there saying some students are having trouble logging in. You know what? I'm just going to pause the recording for a minute and wait maybe another minute or two just to give people a chance. Okay, we're getting some more numbers. Okay, thanks, Colin. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about disaster ethics. Whoops, I better put the, oh no, record is still on. Screen sharing is paused. Can you see my screen now? It says my screen sharing is paused for some reason. Okay, let's try this again. Share screen. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about disaster ethics, which is basically a subset of the area of ethics, which is just a huge area. I can only do so much in an hour and a half, but hopefully there'll be time to explore some of the most important aspects of it. And we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. Just to let you know, I'm going to have to head out at 2:30. I won't be able to stay past then, but hopefully that will give us enough time. So in terms of what I want to try and briefly cover today, I just want to sort of do a quick introduction, set the stage for what we're going to be talking about, discuss what is ethics and the main areas of ethical study, which is metaethics, normative ethics, and descriptive ethics. Go through the issue of an ethical dilemma, maybe have a little bit of time to talk about one or two of them. Discuss the issue of moral traps and ethical leadership. Then things that are specific to ethics within the context of disasters, and then a few concluding comments. That's my plan for the next while. Oops. Okay, so I teach a couple courses in ethics and emergency management at York University. And after doing it for a couple of years, I really felt there wasn't good material to use as a basis for a course. So as I developed the material, I eventually put it all together in a book, which is basically my course notes on steroids. And so much of my talk is based on the material from this book. If you want to go into more detail on any of it, it's like $7 on, Amazon. It's pretty cheap. But a lot of these things you can just get information on by Googling topics. There's a ton of information on the web about ethics. So I have some polls I'd like to do just to help set the stage for it. So the first survey, just in terms of how you think of yourself on a scale of, say, 1 to 5, where 1 is much less moral than the average person, 5 is much more moral. I'm going to bring up that poll and launch it. So hopefully something came up on your screen where you can input, what your answer would be. Okay, so this is a somewhat small sample. So what you see in terms of those, end the poll and share the results. So you can see basically 5 people were about average, 7 people more moral than average. And this is typical of the results that you get from this sort of poll. I even see it with respect to things like driving, for example. If you ask people, are you about an average driver, less good than average, more good than average, and so forth, you also tend to see a very positive bias. But by the very definition of average, about half of people would be less moral than average, about half people would be more moral than average. The mode would be about average. And what you're seeing here is a bias. So if we just go back to research that's been done on how people see themselves, there's a consistent bias that's present in society that's cross-cultural. That people tend to see themselves as being more ethical than their peers, their supervisors, or other people that they know. And in fact, this is a kind of bias that exists across many aspects of character and personality and abilities, not just in terms of morality. But when we do get to the issue of morality, one study indicated that we do tend to be most irrational in that aspect of it. And we do have a tendency to be self-righteous. This is part of what's called the self-enhancement effect. Also related to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is people's tendency to be overconfident in their evaluations of things, especially as they tend to lack knowledge about them. And so what we have, and this includes you and this includes me, is that there's a systemic bias in society. It tends to view other people as less moral than ourselves and tends to devalue the moral stances of those who disagree with us. So this is everybody, no matter how hard you try to be unbiased about yourself, it's pretty hard to do that. And so it's an important question is how objectively do you see yourself? You can go 2 ways, right? So you can see yourself as much better than you actually are in a variety of ways. And that's what the results typically get. Of course, some people, are going to have self-esteem issues and would be the other end of the spectrum. But that is more unusual. It's much more common to have this, for people to have this positive bias. So you guys and myself, the chances are we are not as moral as we think we are because of this self-enhancement effect. And here's another survey I would like to ask you. So basically, let's say you guys all think you're, fairly good people. And so the question I'm going to ask is, you think you're basically a good person. Could you be induced or seduced? Not forced, but just, sort of pushed somewhat into behaving in an evil way. So I'm going to put that poll up again and launch it and see what you guys say. Oh, I made a typo. I apologize for that. It starts with very likely, likely, neutral. The next one should be unlikely, 4th row down. So that's a mistake I made. So consider the 4th row down to be unlikely. Okay, so basically, well, it's a pretty bell-shaped curve, sort of a normal distribution. A number of you are saying it's likely or very likely that you could behave in an evil way, and some of you less so. Okay, I'm going to share the results just so you can see them. I'm sorry about that typo mistake I made there. So you can see those results. Oops. So this goes to what's called situational ethics. So we have certain dispositions. We're disposed to act in certain ways, perhaps a moral way. But then we are all products of our environment. We all feel peer pressure. There are all sorts of pushes or forces that make us tend to act in particular kinds of ways. And the evidence is that situational forces really dominate dispositional forces. So this is the situations we find ourselves in that tend to dominate, not for everybody, but for most people in terms of how we actually behave. One example of that, I've got a video here, but I'm not going to share it just because we only have an hour and a half, is the Milgram experiment, which some of you might be familiar with. So maybe I'll just give a little background on that first. So this was done by Stanley Milgram, I think it was at Yale, after World War II. And he was particularly interested in the atrocities that were committed during the Second World War by Nazi Germany, many of which were conducted just by really ordinary citizens. And he was just interested, how could ordinary citizens who were normally good people going about their lives become engaged in the horrible, despicable, evil practices that were committed by the Nazi regime. And what he found was, and he did an experiment, and so he took a bunch of people, they were initially white males, and did an experiment with them, and they had to give the subject increasingly strong electric shocks if they didn't do well responding to certain questions. Now, those shocks were not really given to these people. The actual subjects were the people who were given the shocks, not the person receiving the shocks. So there was deception in this experiment. But the shocks went all the way from, maybe 15 volts or something like that to 450 volts, levels that were potentially fatal to people with heart conditions and so forth. And he wanted to see how far people would progress if they were just told to by a guy in a white coat with a clipboard at the university. So there you are, there's a guy, you're being paid like 20 bucks or whatever. The guy in a white coat, he's sort of an authority figure. He says, okay, keep giving these shocks, keep giving these shocks. And the initial predictions were that a very small percentage, and this was a prediction by psychiatrists at the time, that a very small percentage of people would go up to those maximum levels of shock because you're harming people, potentially killing them, and why would you do it? But they actually found that in the experiment, something like 60 or 65% of the people went right up to the maximum level of giving those shocks. And it was a shocking experiment. So they were potentially harming and killing people who were in the other room yelling, stop, stop, I don't want, let me out of here, my heart's giving me trouble. And they would keep giving increasingly strong shocks, because that guy in the white coat said, no, you have to continue, and it's my responsibility. So his conclusion was that ordinary people simply doing their jobs without being hostile can become agents in a terribly destructive process. And this is an example of situational ethics. And it comes to this whole issue of obedience, obedience to authority, which is what he was particularly interested in. We all work in organizations, and probably pretty large organizations. So this issue of the degree to which our behavior is situational, how is that a function of organizations? So if you take a look at research on it, if you look at just say organizational size, one finding is that as the size of an organization increases, individual ethical beliefs and decision-making behaviors decrease. What about the level? As an employee's level in an organization increases, as they get to higher levels of management, research shows that employees' ethical beliefs and decision-making behavior decreases. So I'm not sure about cause and effect here. It might be complicated. Maybe people who are less ethical are more likely to get promoted for various reasons. Or maybe as you get to higher levels in an organization, you're just subjected to pressures that make you tend to behave in less ethical ways, or a combination of both. When there's conformity, an individual's ethical beliefs and decision-making behaviors tend to become increasingly congruent with top management's beliefs. But if you look at the previous sort of research, what it shows that the higher you are, when you get to top management, you're less likely to be to have good ethical beliefs and moral behavior, and so that's not necessarily an encouraging result. And so the conclusion I draw from this anyway is that people who work in larger organizations are subjected to situational forces that decreases moral behavior. And one of the trends in modernity and modern society is that more and more people tend to work in large and larger organizations. So I really do think this is one of the moral crises of our time, the way organizations impact people's ethical behavior. And because of that, we have a need for moral leadership and professional codes of ethics and conduct for individuals, but also for organizations. And I think that need is increasing over time. You're all probably aware of like the many ethical lapses that have happened by organizations. Here's another question I want to ask you, and we're still setting the stage here. We haven't got to the ethical sort of theory yet. So according to your moral compass, like what is deep inside your nature, which of the following two events is the worst disaster? The loss of $1 million to a billionaire, or $100,000 to a family that isn't worth anywhere near the billionaire, say just $110,000. And let's launch that poll and see what you say. Oh, people are still voting. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So again, this is typically what you see. The vast majority of people will say the loss of $100,000 to a family whose total wealth is $110,000 is a worse disaster. So when we rank disasters or when we do a risk analysis, there's a choice, although there are many choices. But one of the choices is, what metrics do you use to try and do the ranking or to try and estimate risk? One choice is to use total economic damage on the economic side, not looking at like fatalities and so forth. Another choice would to be used damage as a percentage of wealth. Now, I'm not going to say one choice is right and another choice is wrong, but what I am saying is the choice of that metric will tilt the results of your study in different directions. So if you use total damage, that tilts the rankings towards the rich and the powerful in society. If you use damage as a percentage of wealth, it tilts the rankings towards the poor and the vulnerable. I have taken a look at a lot of disaster lists and a lot of disaster risk analyses. I did one study where I looked at every state in the United States, every province in Canada, and about a dozen national level risk assessments. And every single one of them used total damage. Not a single one of them addressed the values associated with using that metric, the fact that that choice of metric would tilt the analysis in one direction, whereas a different metric would tilt it in a different direction. And again, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. It's really, what is the purpose for which you're doing this analysis? And what metrics best mesh with that purpose? But the point I am making is that many of the metrics and methodologies used in disaster risk reduction, they are underlain by moral judgments that are essentially never acknowledged or discussed, but that are just deterministic in terms of the kinds of outcomes you get. And that those metrics and methodologies tend to reinforce existing power and wealth structures. Because, for example, they use total economic damage. I think there are a lot of problems with the way risk analyses are done within the emergency management community, and generally even. But one of the big ones to my mind is that they do not include an ethical analysis. So an ethical analysis would look at the methodology. It would look at the metrics used. It would discuss how those affect the outcomes and the ways that they should be used or should not be used, and so forth. But none of these things are ever even acknowledged in these disaster rankings or risk analyses. You certainly see a lot of literature on, the importance of addressing vulnerable communities as we practice, disaster risk reduction, and in other aspects of the field, it is absolutely acknowledged. And in my experience with emergency managers in general is that they're like very socially conscious people who are very interested in these aspects of it, but nevertheless, in terms of the way the profession is practiced, many aspects of it ignore this whole area of morals and ethics, where it is actually extremely significant and should be addressed. So that's a conclusion I have from that. So here, oops. What's coming next? So hence the need for ethical analyses. So what I've done in setting the stage is I'm trying to say that the way we conduct our business, we cannot avoid ethics and morality. And even if we think it's not there, it is still there. We're just not acknowledging it. But our unconscious biases or assumptions or worldviews are going to shape how we do, risk analysis or our practice or whatever. And it's something that's just widely unacknowledged in our profession, and it needs to change. So we need to understand ethics. Let's talk about what it is. So I'm going to say, essentially, it's a study of three main things. And I'm coming at this from the Western tradition of ethics. There's also an Eastern tradition, that I really am not that familiar with and I can't speak to. But in the Western tradition, there's a discussion of meta-ethics, which is the very nature of morality. So it would look at questions like, are there such things as absolute rights or absolute wrongs, and where does morality come from? You may say something is absolutely wrong no matter what culture or wherever you live or geography, like it is just wrong, 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 no matter what. So that would be an example of an absolute wrong. And maybe killing would be an example. And there might be absolute rights too. Another camp in this area that is ethical relativity, where we say what is right or wrong is a function of culture and where and when you live. And there might not necessarily be some such thing as an absolute right or wrong. But if you think there is, it's important to ask yourself, where does this come from? And how many things are absolute and what would fit into a relativity camp? Then there's a question of what we ought to do. That's called normative ethics. And here's an example of some cows saying to this other guy, you're a 666 because you should not be doing that. Okay. So what we ought to do is like the 10 Commandments, what should we be doing? And then there's another area of descriptive ethics, which looks at what we actually do. So what we actually do may or may not conform to the way we think we ought to behave. Often it doesn't, unfortunately. But as we go through ethical analysis, it's very important to think about normative ethics, like how ought we how ought we to be behaving, and compare it to descriptive ethics about where we actually behave. There's also an area that's called applied ethics, which is a subset of normative ethics, and codes of ethics and conducts is an example of that. Now, I'll just mention I've been involved in a project, a FEMA project, in one of their working groups to develop a code of ethics for the emergency management profession. And we've gone through phase one of it. It's gone out for public review. And I think there are like 200 or 300 comments we got back. I haven't seen them yet. So our next task is going to be to go through that comments and do a revision of the code according to what they're like, and then put this code out to the profession and see to what degree, we get people interested in it. So again, meta ethics, we talked about things like what is goodness. Different people might have different feelings about what is good. Is it objective? Is it just cultural convention and so forth? But I'm really not going to deal very much with the meta-ethical side of things in this talk. When we get to normative ethics, in other words, what ought we to do or what should we to do, there are different approaches. One approach is called utilitarianism, which is about maximizing some utility or optimizing it, perhaps. So it might be happiness. You might say, okay, I want to maximize happiness, or you want to maximize the number of people who live, or the fewest people who die, or something. It's all about this kind of calculation. Now, it's based upon the notion that the end justifies the means. Some aspects of utilitarianism will put a constraint in that, saying, okay, yeah, we want to maximize utility, but at the same time, we have to constrain ourselves. Like we don't want to do terrible things to the few in order to make things a little bit better for the many. There has to be some constraints on it. But basically, utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number. There are some issues with it. One is, how do you define and measure goodness? So different people will, depending on their values, will have different ideas about what is good. Say for an environmentalist, it might be the ecological health of an area, of a natural area. For somebody who builds houses or something, goodness might be how many houses we build for people. So they would just have different values in terms of what is good. So that's one issue that makes utilitarianism challenging. Then there's who's good, like are there losers? So sometimes what's good for some people are bad for other people. So there can be winners and losers. It does require an ability to predict the future. In some situations, that might be relatively easy. In other situations, it might be really hard to predict the future. And where there's a lot of uncertainty and you're not sure how the future is going to evolve, then utilitarianism is a difficult approach to use. It is very useful. It is an important way to think about issues, but it has been used to justify morally repugnant actions to create what was considered to be a greater good. An example of that was in Germany, just before and during World War II, eugenics. So eugenics is basically selection of desirable, heritable characteristics to improve future generations. So we do that with cows and dogs and cats and all sorts of animals in order to breed them to be better in our view. And so eugenics was a movement. It was strong in North America too, in the early part of the 1900s. And it just seemed to make sense. Well, why don't we make people better just by doing what we do with animals? It seemed to make a lot of sense. But when you take it to an extreme, you can get what happened in Germany. So here's a group of relatively happy-looking people. This was taken in Germany during this time period. I'm not sure exactly which year. And this was the staff of a euthanasia center. And these kids, most of them were euthanized. So they were children who, for one reason or another, had a disability and were considered not to be good stock for the future German population. So this is an example of utilitarianism being used to justify morally repugnant or even evil actions. Then there's what's called deontological ethics, which is quite different from utilitarianism. So in utilitarianism, you're trying to determine what the greatest good is. And whatever leads to the best outcome, by whatever measure of goodness you're using, that's what is the moral thing to do. So deontological ethics, and Kant was a philosopher who is referenced a lot in these approaches, basically says, okay, it's not about that. It's some things are just right and some things are wrong. We have duties and obligations, and we should do the right thing no matter what. So that's a deontological ethic. So one of the advantages of it is that it can create a strong moral compass. So if you had deontological ethics and you were looking at euthanizing children because of eugenics, you might say, oh, let's hold back from that. That's just wrong, so that's an advantage. But you really do have to look at the source of the belief of right and wrong. Where does right and wrong come from? Where does it come from? Does it come from God? Is it divine command theory? Does it come from nature? There's this whole area called natural law, which tries to use reason to determine what is right and what is wrong. Is it a function of your culture? And depending on where you sit in your belief system, people have different beliefs about right is wrong. So it's important to understand where those beliefs come from. So the 10 Commandments are an example of a deontological approach. It is wrong to kill. It is right to honor thy mother and thy father, for example. So again, conflicting beliefs will create conflict and sometimes ethical dilemmas. The same way it can in utilitarianism. Two utilitarianisms could be in conflict with each other because of different values. And again, this can result in morally repugnant outcomes, or what are considered morally repugnant outcomes by many people, if you rigidly hold to a specific moral code. And an example of this, at least in the West, is honor killing. So there are some places in the world where girls will be killed for acting in ways that are immoral, like maybe going on a date or just leaving their village or not behaving in ways that the local culture feels they should. So we would consider that a morally repugnant thing to do, honor killings within Canadian culture. And even in many countries where it happens, like Pakistan, for example, or India, it's still illegal, but local cultures still feel for our family to keep its honor, we have to do this. So that's an example of a trap you can fall into with deontological ethics. An example within our profession is the Sphere Handbook, and they have some charters and protection principles in terms of minimum standards for humanitarian response that are based on deontological ethics. Things like the right to life with dignity, the right to receive humanitarian assistance, the right to protection, security, so forth. Do no harm, you often see do no harm as a principle, so that's a deontological principle. So these are important aspects of sort of ethical approaches to the kind of work we do. So a third area within ethical theory, and I can't cover them all, so I'm just trying to cover a few of the major ones, is called virtue ethics. And that is not about the greatest good for the greatest number. It's not about whether you're following your duties and so forth necessarily. It's about your character. It's about having a virtuous character and acting according to those virtues. So there's a long list of potential virtues like honesty, courage, fidelity, beneficence. Now you can have some of these and still be considered by many an evil person. For example, you could say Hitler had fidelity. he was basically true to his word. But still, most of us looking back say, his ideas were evil. So he was true to them. He was true to evil. He's still evil. But there's a long list of what's considered virtues. There is this discussion of when can a virtue become a vice. So Socrates, for example, was a proponent of the mean or the average or not going to extremes. And so next one example, yeah. So for example, when does a courageous act become foolhardy? So you might want to be courageous, but if you're a single person and you go out and attack a whole army, it's just an act of suicide. So that's an example of a virtue becoming a vice because it's taken to an extreme. But nevertheless, when we look at people, we can consider whether they have these virtues and to what degree. Another one I see is being true to yourself. And that's especially emerged, I guess, in modern society. But I actually have an issue with that. My issue is, it depends who you are. So if you're a sadistic psychopath, I do not want you to be true to yourself. So being true to yourself is a good thing to be if you're a good person. It's not a good thing to be if you're an evil person. So, even as we list these virtues, we have to think about them in terms of like, what does it mean within the context? Are you extreme about it? Are you more moderate about it? What makes sense? The issue of justice is an important area within ethical study. And there are basically 4 different ways of looking at justice. And some of them are more relevant to emergency management than others. So the first one, distributive justice, is very important for the field of emergency and disaster management. An example is disaster financial assistance, like who gets how much of what. That feeds right into the issue of distributive justice. And one of these issues is like equality versus equity. So an equality means, say you give the same to everybody. So let's say in a community, we'll give everybody $5,000. And then you're treating everybody the same. But then the counter argument is, well, needs are different. So why give $5,000 to somebody who's rich when there are poor people who have greater needs? So if you base disaster financial assistance on need, for example, then you're taking an equity approach. This also brings in issues, for example, related to moral hazard. So moral hazard is, let's say you say, I'm going to live in a floodplain because I know the government's going to, pardon the expression, bail me out if there's a flood. That's a moral hazard. In other words, you are taking on additional risk because you know that risk is offset by others who are going to pay it off for you. So that's an example of moral hazard, which the insurance industry has to be really careful of. So as we, have a policy of helping people, and this applies to it, whether it's Medicare or whatever, the social programs that help people out. There are strong reasons for doing it in terms of various ethical arguments, but it can also create moral hazard, which means you might want to put some constraints on the degree or how you handle assistance to try to minimize that. There is procedural justice, which is about how do you treat people fairly. And so things like being transparent, lack of bias, having consistency are important. During mass casualty events where you have large numbers of people going to the hospital and you have a scarcity of resources, this can be an issue. Later on, I think I have another poll about that. Anyway, so how do you go about having procedural justice? And that's a really important aspect within society. Like everybody needs to understand exactly how they're being treated and they're being treated in a fair and equal way. Then there's retributive justice, which is essentially punishing people for doing wrong. Such things like fines, prisons, and proportionality is important to that. Generally speaking, I would say retributive justice is not important for what we do, but it was interesting in terms of the Emergency Act. that was recently invoked, which allowed for fines in prison and other punishments for people who did not follow that act. And finally, there's what's called restorative justice, which tries to restore relationships. So truth and reconciliation committees are an example of this. So for example, in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela kind of took over, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which is an approach to trying healing society. And we have it in Canada now with respect to First Nations. I think it's ongoing. And this is quite different from, let's say, after World War II, the Nuremberg trials, which punished high-ranking Nazis for war crimes and crimes against humanity, which is based on retributive justice. So these are the main four categories of justice. To my mind, the one that is most significant to our field of practice is distributive justice, although procedural justice is quite important as well. So we certainly have to be perceived as, in the things we do, treating people fairly, being transparent, not having bias, and so forth. Okay, let's talk a little bit about descriptive ethics now. So previously, when we talked about utilitarianism or deontological ethics, we were really talking about like how people should act, like follow the 10 Commandments. We have laws, you should follow those laws. These are things we ought to do, things we should do. Do we fall short of them? Sure, even the best of us fall short of them. But this is a kind of ideal for us. When you get into descriptive ethics, then you're really looking at measures of how people in societies actually behave. So one example of this is just corruption. So there's this thing called the Corruption Perceptions Index. And so it's perceived levels of corruption in the public sector across different countries in the world. So Canada actually did pretty well here if you take a look at us, although not as well as Norway and Sweden. But still, we did pretty well, which is nice to see. So I want to ask you another question. If almost everybody else is cheating or is corrupt, is it moral or just for you to cheat and be corrupt? So I'm going to launch this poll and see what you say. Okay, interesting. So I'm going to end that poll. So nobody said yes, nobody. And I'll share the results. So if you said yes, or it depends, you are an ethical relativist. Okay, that's where you sit. And it's basically the theory that morality is relative to the norms of culture. In other words, things are not absolutely wrong. Now this just addressing the issue of corruption. So some of you might be an ethical absolutist if we were on another issue, but with respect to this, you guys are ethical relativists. Nobody said no, so within this category, at least, nobody is an ethical absolutist, which is the notion, which is a very deontological notion, that moral rules are inherently right or wrong and not dependent upon culture or context. So this gets into the area of meta-ethics, really. So to the extent that you guys answered yes or it depends, you're probably more of a utilitarian than you are of a deontologist. Okay. Another example of descriptive ethics relates to what's called the social contract. So a social contract theory, it deals with basically the contract between citizens and those who govern them. So people, citizens, give up their rights, they give up power, they give up authority, they give up freedoms for a larger governance which helps everybody. And to a large degree, it depends on a trusting relationship between citizens and the government. If you take a look at trust, and trust is just fundamental to how well things work. Fundamental to how well things work. It varies a lot by country and culture and so forth, but this is a kind of a global average for trustworthiness as a function of profession. So we just highlighted ordinary men and women here. And again, if you looked at a specific country, you might get a very different result. But you can see that there are only a few categories, doctors, scientists, teachers, and armed forces that are trusted more than ordinary people. And then most other professions are lower down. I wish they had emergency managers on this list. It'd be interesting to see where they are. But anyway, one thing I want you to note is what's at the very bottom of the list. Very bottom list is politicians. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem. And that politicians being at the bottom list is actually consistent across many cultures, many countries. Now, some countries it is worse than others, but it is a fairly persistent result. Here's one example of trust in the government in the United States, going back to 1958 and up to 2015. So in this graph, you can see back in the 1950s and 60s, over 70% of people indicated they had a high degree of trust in the government of the United States. And over time, it has dropped in a noisy kind of way, but still dropped to under 20%. I'm not sure what it would be like in 2022. This data only goes up to 2015. But I suspect it hasn't improved. Now, there may be some problems with this graph. I would think when these surveys were done in 1958, it was probably white American males who were surveyed. And when you get to more recent times, I'm sure those surveys became more cross-cultural, more inclusive of minority groups and so forth. And that may be explaining part of this trend, but nevertheless, it's showing some very interesting results. And I think this lies at the root of a lot of the problems that they're having in the United States. And results in Canada, from what I've seen, are similar in that there's tended to be a loss in trust in government. Just for my own curiosity, I was interested in how this would relate to wars. So I just put in some big events here. So the Vietnam War occurred in the 1960s and 70s, and during that time there was a large loss of trust. A few years after that, it started to rebuild. When the US invaded Iraq in '91, there was a spike, but then afterwards it dropped quite a bit. Then it recovered. 9/11, there was a big drop happening after that. And as the US invaded Iraq in 2003, again, we're seeing a large drop. This is, I'm certainly not saying that those wars were the cause of this loss of trust. I would not be so bold as to conclude that from this graph, but I just found it interesting, so I just wanted to share that with you. So this creates actually a crisis situation. When your population has lost trust in government, then your social contract is just not working well, and it just leads to a lot of bad outcomes. And I think the trend towards authoritarianism and tribalism that we're seeing in much of the West relates to this loss of trust and the diminishment of the social contract. Another important area is environmental ethics. So it deals with things like, what are our duties to nature? Do non-human beings have rights? It's divided up into two general categories. One is called a human-centered or shallow ecological approach. The other is called a nature-centered or deep ecological approach. In the human-centered or shallow ecological approach, basically look at nature. It's important to the degree that we use it. So it's important to the degree that it's important to people. So if there's some species out there or areas out there that don't matter to us, then so what? We only care about the, say, harming nature if the feedbacks in harm us. And that leads to a conservation kind of approach. So we'll conserve what we need to in order so that people will not be harmed. If you go into deep ecology, then you take a different philosophical stance and essentially say non-human beings have rights and we therefore have duties and obligations towards them because we're all part of nature. We're all part of maybe God's creation, depending how you want to look at it. And that leads to a more protection or preservation approach. So this is becoming increasingly important within disaster risk reduction, which is increasingly becoming linked to climate change adaptation and mitigation. So issues like climate change, deforestation, species extinction, pollution, these all are strongly tied to an environmental ethic. And they're just strong links between DRR and protecting and conserving the environment, like mangrove swamps that protect people from storm surges. And so a lot of very practical ways that we can see that it's important to protect the natural environment, whether or not you're embedded into deep ecology or not. There's also a more esoteric kind of theory. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Gaia hypothesis, but it basically looks at the Earth and biological systems as one large, single, integrated ecological entity with a host of negative feedback loops that actually keep conditions on the planet within the boundaries that are favorable to life. So if you look at the extremes of temperature, precipitation, and other things, since life emerged on this planet, it's really been relatively constrained as compared to when life was not on this planet. And there's some really interesting quantitative scientific analyses that take a look at the feedback loops between the biological systems and the atmosphere and other systems that make good arguments that they all are essentially maintaining the conditions on the Earth within a range that's suitable for life. So if you're interested in that, you can look up the James Lovelock Gaia hypothesis and read about that. It's pretty interesting stuff. So let's talk about an ethical dilemma. So first I'll say what it is. So an ethical dilemma is having to make a choice between two rights, two wrongs. So sometimes there's like an ethical decision you make, and it might be a really hard decision to make, but you say, okay, this is the right thing to do. I know it's the right thing to do because of all X, Y, Z, whatever. It might be hard to do it, but still, it's right. Sometimes you're saying, man, I don't know what's right. Should I do A or B? If I do A, there's this good outcome. If I do B, there's that other good outcome. Or if I do A, there's going to be these harms created. If I do B, there are these other harms created. So then you're in an ethical dilemma. An example of that is vaccine mandates. So I'd like to do another survey and see whether you think there should be mandatory public health measures to manage pandemics. So this could be, say, vaccine mandates. I guess it could be masking as well. And let's launch it. See what you guys say. Okay, we're actually getting a fair bit of agreement here. Share results. Okay. So you guys are mostly sitting within your agreeing with mandatory public health measures, which I think is not unusual for people in our profession or the health profession. Those who would disagree with that would lie within what's called a libertarian moral philosophy, which emphasizes the importance of individual freedoms. If you are a communitarian or an egalitarian that emphasizes working with others, duties to others, and so forth, being part of a community, then you lie at the other end of the spectrum. So you guys are mostly in the communitarian, egalitarian range. But the point I want to make is when you're facing an ethical dilemma, there's not necessarily one right answer. So the conclusions you come to are based upon, one, your values. For example, are you a libertarian or are you a communitarian? It's not that libertarians are unethical, so you might be an egalitarian, you might not agree with them, but there's still a moral stance that says individual freedoms are really important. So the variation in values will lead to different outcomes here. But also, depending on which ethical theory you are using, you can also end up with a different outcome in terms of where you stand on some dilemma. My personal approach is I think ethical plurality is incredibly important. So ethical plurality means using a variety of perspectives to try and understand a problem. So saying, okay, yeah, I looked at it from a utilitarian perspective, the greatest good, but what about rights and freedoms? Like, they're not irrelevant. I need to bring that into my mental model and incorporate that as well. If you think back to when we were setting the stage, we were talking, I brought up the history that shows people tend to be overconfident or in their own sort of belief systems, their own values and so forth, dismiss other ones. That's a real trap that we fall into and does not lead to productive dialogue, in fact. So that's the point of this. When you get in an ethical dilemma, it is often not because one thing is right and another is wrong, and they're just people who believe something that's wrong. It's people who believe something different than you, but isn't necessarily wrong. It might be wrong. You might come up with good moral arguments as to why it is. But then that's leading to an ethical plurality approach, where you really are trying to look at things from a variety of perspectives. So I kind of agree with what you guys are saying in terms of mandatory public health measures. This is a quote from, I forget who said that now, give me liberty or give me death, in 1700 and something or other. And this is the United States when they were sort of looking for independence from Britain. And that moral thread is strongly imbued within American society. It's an important ethic in them, this individual liberty. And it's led to people thinking there should not be mask mandates or other kinds of mandates because it violates the human rights. But the phrase, give me freedom or give me death, is remarkably relevant to this particular issue. So, for example, if you look at death rates by vaccination status over in the US over, I forget how long this was, but I think it was a couple of years. So unvaccinated, relatively high rates of deaths. Fully vaccinated but no booster, much smaller. Fully vaccinated with booster, tiny. So people who choose that libertarian freedom approach are valuing individual freedom more than death, in fact. Now, it might not be their death, but sometimes it is. The point I'm trying to make is this is actually a moral choice. Now, it might be based on a value that you think is repugnant, but it is still a moral choice. And then there are moral traps. There are all these traps we can fall into that inhibit or prevent us from behaving the way we might want to. And I'll just say trap number one, obedience to authority is one example, and that was like the Milgram experiment. So do you want some obedience to authority? You certainly do. Like if you're a parent and your child is going to run out in the road and you say, stop, you want that kid to stop. And just for society to function, we need to have some obedience to authority, to obey laws and so forth. But when it's taken to an extreme, like in Hitler's Germany, it can become a trap. So in this one book, and I have the reference at the bottom there, there's a long list of different kinds of traps that you can fall into that can prevent you or inhibit you from behaving in moral ways. And sometimes they're just unconscious. You might not even know it's functioning. Other times they're more obvious. I don't have time to really go into those right now. I'll just mention trap number two, which is authoritarianism, is such an important one. And I think we're seeing that in much of society today. Ethical leadership. We all, or almost all of us, are going to work in systems, in organizations where there are leaders. And there's a ton of research out there about different leadership styles, and they're organized in different ways. Some examples are directive, transactional, transformative rather, authentic leadership, spiritual leadership, and so forth. There's been some literature saying that some of these kinds of styles lend themselves more to ethical leadership than others, especially authentic and spiritual. But again, you can, in many ways, be a great leader. Like, I'll use Hitler and Stalin or Jim Jones, for example. So some of these people were spiritual leaders, like Jim Jones, or transformative leaders, transform society. But if their morals were bad, it didn't all work out in a good way. So I would argue, along with some others who've talked about this, that ethical leadership is less a function of your particular leadership style than of the moral character of the leader. So there's a book called Disaster Ethics by Naomi Zak. And one of the things she talks about in her book is the importance of virtues of leaders, that you want to have leaders who have good moral character, who are virtuous people. So what are the characteristics of ethical leaders? There's been a fair bit written about it, and I'm just including a few points here. One is they serve as role models for their followers. They communicate and justify their actions, make ethics salient in terms of what they do. They set ethical standards. They reward ethical conduct. They punish unethical behavior. And they incorporate ethical decision-making processes and consider the ethical consequences of their decisions, try to make fair choices. When you have large organizations, it is important not just to have ethical people, it's important to have a culture that reinforces ethical behavior and formal processes in place that support that. If you don't have all those elements there, then it's going to be very difficult to have an ethical organization. This is an older sort of list of characteristics of an ethical leader, which I kind of like. So in the ethical leaders, humble, concerned for the greater good, that's utilitarianism. Honest and straightforward, virtue ethics, fulfills commitments, strives for fairness, takes responsibility, shows respect for the individual, that's all virtue ethics. Encourages and develops others, serves others, shows courage, that's called moral courage, to stand up for right. So I would say somebody of that nature, like one of my picks would be Nelson Mandela. The unethical leader is the opposite. And I may never be able to go there now, but I would use this person as an example in North Korea as somebody who's an unethical leader. It's about taking moral action. So it's fine to feel a certain way and think a certain way, but unless you take moral actions, you're really not behaving in a moral way. And research suggests there are like 3 aspects of this that could make this happen. One is that your moral identity is important to you. So when you think about yourself, your self-image, an important part of that self-image is your moral identity, like your virtues. Then next, do you have confidence in your ability to carry out ethical decisions or to carry out your responsibilities? And finally, do you have moral courage? In other words, the courage, even if it could potentially get you in trouble, to act in a way that you consider moral. Whistleblowers do this, for example. So they have moral identity, moral confidence, and moral courage. And they often use these to be a highly ethical person. I'm not going to suggest that people become whistleblowers. If you look at the outcomes for whistleblowers in their professional life, after they've blown the whistle, and even in their personal lives, outcomes are really bad. So if you're going to be a whistleblower, you could basically destroy your professional career and perhaps your personal life as well. And maybe there are other ways to try and imbue ethics into your organization by working within the system. But anyway, so those are some characteristics of moral leaders who really work to carry out their vision. Again, choosing between two rights and two wrongs, I was just interested in terms of ventilators. So here's another survey. Who gets ventilators when there's a scarcity? So I'm just going to share this and see what you guys say. So I just picked, a bunch of possibilities, kind of at random. Okay, I'll share it now. Okay, so that's interesting. Procedural ethics is really important here. So for example, nobody did, but if you had picked goodness, that is an appealing way to do it. Like I'd rather give the ventilator to a humanitarian who's served, people his whole life and tried to do nothing but good before a mass murderer. But again, how do you implement that? Like who would have the moral authority, the wisdom, so forth to decide who is better than other people? So some things can be appealing, but essentially impossible to implement. Vaccinated before unvaccinated is an interesting argument. I've talked to a number of people who feel strongly about that. But then again, that's going to violate actually a norm that we have in our society about not punishing people for behaving in ways that doesn't contribute to the health, like smoking a lot or whatever. And most of you are in line with triage. Now in Italy, I know at one point anyway, at the beginning of the pandemic, when they were facing this problem, they did give priority to younger people. And there's some ethical arguments that can support that. Again, not saying one is right and another is wrong. There are ethical arguments for each one. And if you use an ethical plurality approach, then you can approach it in a more holistic way. For disasters, how are we doing for time? 2:08, another 20 minutes. So disasters are a unique context because we have scarce resources. And in the moment, limited time for decision-making, although lots of time for decision-making when there's not a disaster. Sometimes, there's urgency, lack of information, your systems have failed. Usual procedures might be counterproductive, like trying to purchase stuff. And they can be opportunities for change, like to build back better. And this could lead to a whole bunch of ethical issues, like if there's scarce resources, like the ventilators, how do you distribute them? How do you prioritize people? What about hoarding and profiteering? Risk analysis versus the precautionary principle, like the precautionary principle is a hugely important tool that we should be using more, for many issues than we are. To what degree should individual rights and freedoms be constrained for the greater good? Again, that's, vaccine mandates, for example. How far does duty of care and duty of respond go? And when you're talking about building back better for whom? Like sometimes you're building back better for the rich people and not for the poor people. This whole issue about duty of care, well, abandonment. There was an interesting case of a fire department that did not respond to a fire call because they hadn't paid their bills. 2 children died. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, many police officers left their posts without permission, basically abandoned their posts. In nursing homes, there have been various examples of people just abandoned in nursing homes. Sometimes during COVID, the Katrina nursing home was during a flood. What is the duty of care for those people in those homes? What is the duty of care to healthcare workers during COVID? They were at increasing risk, probably in most cases. What are the implications of that in terms of how we think about their duty to care for others? So how far does duty of care go? We have to ask what's fair. So certainly people who are paramedics or doctors or whatever have said, okay, I'm going I'm being exposed to a greater degree of risk because of my job, and I accept that. But that is not an unlimited risk. It's still limited, and you still have to think about in a disaster situation, how far does it go? And if people are taking on these extra risks, what about reciprocal obligations? Does not that create duties on the part of the people they serve to reciprocate to them because of the risk that they've taken? And if we don't take good enough care of them, whether it's PPE or whatever, why should they take care of us? And this is just an Ontario doctor at the bottom here. It's a quote from her that I found on the web. She feels so at risk in her community because there was so much anger around COVID vaccinations and so forth that her husband had to pick her up because she didn't even feel safe working at home. Precautionary principle. I mentioned before about how important it is. And if you haven't read much about it, I would just encourage you to do some research on it. So there are different formulations of the precautionary principle. Maybe the first thing I should say is when it is invoked, it is often not invoked in a very robust way, and it tends not to be well understood. When you invoke the precautionary principle, you really have to meet a set of conditions. And if those conditions are not met, then you're not invoking the precautionary principle in a valid way. There's what's called the weak formulation, the strong formulation. So the weak formulation says, even if you don't have full scientific certainty, that doesn't mean you should postpone cost-effective measures to prevent a harmful thing from happening. But it doesn't shift the burden of proof to the proponents. The strong formulation does shift the burden of proof, and it says you should take precautionary measures, even if there's scientific uncertainty. So cigarette smoking is a good example of this. Back in the maybe 30s and 40s and 50s, there was increasing evidence that cigarette smoking was bad for people's health. There wasn't scientific proof at some point, but there was increasing evidence, and the evidence was credible. The cigarette companies were basically saying, well, prove to me it's harmful, prove it. That was the tobacco industry. So they were putting the burden of proof on the people who are worried about cigarettes. Whereas the strong approach would say, we might not have proof, but we still have credible evidence. So you know what? The burden of proof is on you to prove that they're safe. So this is the precautionary principle. And whether you're talking about climate change or smoking or asbestosis, there's a large range of issues where it can be used. It is important where you cannot do a good risk analysis, where you don't have good probabilities, you don't know consequences necessarily well, there's uncertainty, but the outcomes can be really horrible and irreversible, like death, for example. So those are some of the conditions you want when you're going to use the precautionary principle. And it's really not about how to be right. It's about how not to be wrong. So like, let's say you're thinking about evacuation, community, maybe this Category 5 hurricane is going to hit us, maybe it's not, we're not sure. So if you're really thinking about how am I going to be right? How am I going to decide whether to evacuate or not? If you're in that column, it's really hard to decide because there's just uncertainty. But if you look at how not to be wrong, there are two ways how not to be wrong in the extreme case. You could say, well, I could evacuate and the hurricane misses us, so we've been inconvenienced. Or we can not evacuate and the hurricane hits us and we're destroyed. So if those are your two choices about the way you could be wrong, one is way worse than the other. So the conclusion is the way not to be wrong is not to engage in that potential for total destruction, for ruin. But say, okay, might not happen, but we're going to evacuate, and that's a safer option. Sometimes we focus way too much. It's a mindset of trying to come up with the right decision, and you can get locked into that. It's kind of sometimes it's a trap. And the way to avoid the trap is to think about not how I need to be right, but how I need to be not wrong. So just a few concluding thoughts. I'm arguing that ethical thinking is fundamental to disaster management. but it is a complex process. Often there's no single correct answer, maybe not even a best answer. And solutions are going to depend upon values and ethical orientations. But nevertheless, we have to bring that into our profession in a much more robust way than we have so far. And if you're going to do it in a successful way, you need to have a moral leadership. You need to have a culture that supports ethical thinking, and you need to embed ethical values into formal professional and organizational policies. Last slide. This is all really complex, and you can go through a lot of cognitive analytical thinking, but there are 3 intuitive tests you can use to guide your decisions. And my friend and colleague Mark Schwartz is the one who told me about these. One is the pillow test, would allow you to sleep at night. The child test, what would you tell your kid to do? And finally, the newspaper test, what would you want your decision to be in the public view? So these are 3 sort of intuitive tests you can use to help with your moral compass. So that's the end of the presentation. I can have another 10 minutes where I could answer any questions or we could have some discussion. Oh, Daniel, that's a cutie.
Yes, David, how would you like to take questions?
Yeah, just unmute and just start asking. No questions. I have a question. Daniel, how old is your baby?
She is 6.5 months, and the 3.5-year-old just ran inside and started making a mess. But yeah, a little bit hard to focus around here.
I bet.
I have a
Smile,
question,
though.
David.
Okay.
In international humanitarian response, until and unless a host country which is affected by an event requests for international assistance, the UN system does not activate to go into and respond to the emergency to save people's life. In such a complex situation, while UN OCHA claims that they respond within 15 days, but then in the Pakistani context in 2011 flooding, the government did not request for international assistance until after almost 1.5 months, which was devastating for people who were being affected by the floods. So in such kind of situation, how the ethics play in disastrous events?
I guess you would have to ask whether the government was fulfilling their duties and obligations to their citizens. So again, it goes to the nature of the social contract, and it's different in every country. So some countries have put a lot more into response and recovery and disaster financial assistance than others. So in that point, the legal and policy framework would be very important in terms of determining whether the government abrogated their duties or fulfilled them. So yeah, it sounds like they didn't do a very good job, but I guess that would be my response.
Unless there is another question, I would quickly like to share one personal experience while working for an international non-governmental organization, which had in the same disastrous event, flooding, they had the supplies, hygiene kits, but they were just sitting in their stores, and I could not understand why they were not responding to the emergency. It took weeks, and still they were undecisive. So it was so frustrating that why the decision is not being made by the management, who had the decision-making power to respond to emergency. If they do not have their own field staff in that specific area which is affected by the flood, they could hand over to, for example, certain credible UN agency like UNICEF to distribute those hygiene kits to the affected people.
I mean, sometimes corruption is an issue in terms of how aid is distributed. But there's also this area, which is the duty to be competent. So if you have a job, especially if it's a job that involves, potential harm or help for other people, there's just the duty to be competent in your job. And so if you fail in that, then you could say that is immoral. That is immoral. So whether it's somebody in the healthcare industry, it could be a doctor, nurse who's not competent and they're harming people, then that is a moral failure. It's not just a technical failure, it's also, I think, a moral failure because you're failing in your duty. And if you're not competent in your job, then you have a duty to become competent, right? And if you haven't done that, then I do think that's a moral failure.
We still have 8 minutes left. Anyone else would like
Carson,
to ask a question?
Yeah, Carson has his hand up.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things we've been learning throughout this disaster management program is really the importance of participatory decision-making and community involvement, community engagement, and then also during a disaster event, empowering local community organizations and other kind of direct community aid to come to the aid of their friends and neighbors. And what I've been struggling with is, what do you do when those communities are deciding to provide that aid or to decide to provide those supports in unequitable ways? And if that is kind of the decision that that community has made, what is our role as disaster managers in kind of helping to push that towards equity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are some things that are just outside of our span of control, right? That it is what it is and nothing we can do about it. But I guess if you're working with the communities, I would see your role as to present the moral arguments or other arguments too, maybe there are policy issues as well, as to how it should be done differently. And then if the community has the power to make those decisions and it doesn't listen to you, then like you've done your part. Sometimes life sucks. Yeah. Daniel?
Yeah, I just wanted to share a thought I had in response to your thoughts around risk analysis earlier. I just put it in the chat. You were talking about like a lack of ethics and like equitable analysis at like the local level. And I think often what happens is we have these systems that are meant to be scalable and meant to be applied across like many different contexts. And the emphasis gets placed on the kind of the system integrity of that framework. But I just want to know what's your thoughts about the trade-offs of like having a policy framework that can be applied across many different situations, which may result in, if people follow it too rigorously, may result in sorry, I'm having a hard time concentrating. It may result in some unethical decisions in like a microcosm, but someone somewhere has done the equation that on average people will, using this policy tool, make better analysis over a wider set of contexts.
That's a really complex question. Some things scale up well, another thing, say within the policy environment, and other things do not scale up well. So for example, if you're comparing a smaller emergency with a catastrophe, the strategies and tactics used to manage an emergency do not scale up well to a catastrophe. Because it's a much more interconnected, complex event that becomes a wicked problem, and it's just, so that's an example of something that doesn't work well. I think that's a long conversation, and I'm not sure how to really respond to it in just a minute or two.
My bad. That was a gotcha.
I just want to mention, like, one of the ethical issues that I think is hugely important goes to how risk is constructed in society in the first place. We spend a lot of time thinking about mitigating risk and prevention and a lot in response and recovery. But if we look at the resources that are put into disaster risk reduction, say globally, and compare it to the economic inputs into those policies or processes that create risk, then the things that create risk just swamp what is done to try and prevent risk. And I think one example of this is just critical infrastructure. So if you think of critical infrastructure, something like, I don't know the right number exactly, but maybe 80% of it is owned by the private sector. The private sector has conflicting duties. Their primary obligations are to their shareholders. It's to make a profit. And if they want to become good corporate citizens of the country and so forth, but they have a conflict there, right? And profit, especially short-term profit, is often emphasized. But critical infrastructure, over the past, say, 50 or 60 years, much of it has really been transformed to what I would call public goods. And to manage a public good, the primary duty, I believe, should be to the citizens who depend on those goods. So when you have 80% of your critical infrastructure residing in the private sector and you consider them to be public goods, there's an ethical tension there, which is structural in society. And that structural, if you look at, like, whether it's power failure in Texas or that train crash that happened in Quebec a few years ago, there are just so many examples of how a neoliberal economic philosophy, private sector companies trying to maximize profit, have resulted in unsafe conditions that basically create the disaster that's going to happen eventually. And that's because of this whole sort of neoliberal philosophy about moving towards privatization. And this is really a fundamental political and ethical value in society, which is embedded in our structure in the West, that really is responsible for the creation of much of the risk in society. So there are a lot of these issues in terms of, like, on the smaller scale and how we deal with specific things, but there are also ethics in terms of very broad issues of how risk is created and managed in society sort of writ large. And I have about 1 minute left. Sorry.
Is there any quick question asked?
Okay, well, I want to thank you for inviting me. I'll share the recording link with you later today.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I would like to thank David Atkin for your time and such a wonderful presentation on behalf of this class, DEM 602. And if students have any questions, then later on I would redirect those questions to you, and I am sure Dave would be happy to respond to those questions.
Sure.
So once again, thank you very much. Thank you all of students who have taken our time and have participated, and have a wonderful day. See you next time.
I put my email in the chat in case anybody wants to send me a question or a comment or whatever. Anyway, have a great day, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.